Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to be doing another motion graphics tutorial with After Effects, and specifically we're going to be learning how to use the write on effect in order to animate growing vines. The write on effect is a really useful way to be able to animate a matte without having to use a mask or manipulate any other type of element. It's kind of similar to how the stroke effect works. So instead of creating a spline, we're just going to be animating a brush stroke essentially. So it's going to give you an effect kind of like this. Alright, so if that sounds interesting, let's get started. I've already got my elements in here, but we need to make a composition. So I'm using UHD 4K, 30 FPS, and a duration of 300 frames, so 10 seconds. So the first thing I want to do is make a nice appealing background. I'm going to set this up to 100, right click, make a new solid, call it background. Then I'm looking for a gradient ramp effect. And I'm just going to pick a sky color. And then for the lower one, I'm going to pick just a soft greenish color or something, kind of like this. Maybe go back up, make this a little bit lighter, something more like that. Alright, so then with our vine elements, I'm going to pull these down. Alright, so I'm going to take this one over here, rotate it around. And these elements are from a stock footage website, so unlikely to be able to find the same thing. But the point of this tutorial is to show you how to use the effect, but you should be able to do it with your own images. So I'm just going to flip this around here, and I'm just going to position these vines in a way that I could have growing written up here and then vines written down here. Squash these in a little bit, do something more like that. Do the same thing here, pull this in a bit. Maybe this is a little bit small. Same for this one. And then all I'm going to do here is just trim off some of these leaves. I'll do this with the mask tool. Click M and then change this to subtract. Click F and we can feather this just a little bit. I'll do it on the next one as well. Let's trim these since they're getting a little bit too close. Something like that is fine. Click M. Change the type to subtract, then click F, and then we'll feather it about 10 pixels. Okay, so as far as placement goes, this is looking pretty good. We can play around with this later. But what we're gonna do next is first rename this. So this one is the right vine. And on this one, we'll do vine left. Both of these could use a curves effect. I'll pull this up quite a bit. It's not really any super bright values, so don't worry about clipping too much, but then just to lift this up very slightly. And I'll copy this curves and paste it on the other one as well. Okay, so that's looking pretty good for right now. Next, for the text. So we're gonna grab just a text layer, type in growing, and then we'll do another one for vines. So on growing, if we want this to wrap around the contours of this vine or branch, select the layer, click the pen tool, and then all you need to do is trace the contour that you want the text to follow. So something like this will be pretty good. If you hold down the Alt key, you can just alter one of the sides of the Bezier curve. Now on that text layer, open it up, go to text, open up path options, and then on the path, click the mask that you just drew. And when you click it, the text will conform to that line. We'll do the same thing with vines. Drag out the outline of the branch. And the curve can be longer or shorter. If it's shorter, the text will drop off, and if it's longer, the text won't reach that far. So open this up, go to text, path options, and change the path to mask 1. Okay, so now we've got the text placed where we want it to be. I think vines might be a little bit too rotated, so before we do this next part, I'm just going to grab both of these layers and I'm just going to rotate them around just a little bit. Something more like that, and I'll pull these in a bit so they're more like this. Go back to vines, and then I'm just going to pull this up, match the path along with the vine. That just looks a little bit neater in my opinion. Now in order to get these to pop out a little bit more, I'm going to fill in the color. So I could select the text and go into the character color, but I find it easier just to add a fill effect. So with the fill effect, we can sample one of the leaves just to get an idea of what that color is more quickly, and then pull it up a little bit. And then what I'm going to do, grab the same thing, put that on vines, but then on both of these layers, we're going to duplicate them. Control D, and then on the layer underneath, If we darken the color of the fill, so I'll go to brightness, let's pull this down. And then using the shift key and the arrow keys, I'm just gonna move this over a little bit. So I can do something like that. So the shift key allows you to step further, and just using the arrow keys allow you to do very fine stepping. So this just makes it look like the text is a little bit more, well, it's extruded and has a little bit more depth to it. So I'll grab that fill effect and then paste it on the lower layer of vines, something kind of like that. And now we're ready for the write on effect portion. So with all 4 of these text layers, I'm just going to hide them all. And then I'm going to show you the whole point of this tutorial. So the effect we're looking for is called the write on effect. And the way this works is it basically allows you to use a brush and draw along the contours of whatever you're trying to paint. An alternate way of doing this would be to use the pen tool and just draw out splines in the direction you want, and then use the stroke effect to trace along the splines. So the write on effect is a little bit more manual, but at the same time, it does give you a little bit more control. So how this works, you can put it directly on the image if you want to, but you can only use one write on effect, but we're going to use a different write on effect for every single branch that you can see here. So we will need quite a few write on effects, and in order to utilize that, we're going to need to create a new solid. So we'll call this Vine Write Matte. I'm going to switch this back to layer name so we can see what we've renamed these as. So on this Vine Matte here, we're going to grab the write on effect and paste it. So right away, you might not be able to tell what's going on, and that's because the brush is always put right at the very origin, and at 4K, 2 pixels is very little. So let's pull this up so we can actually see it. And then we're gonna just drag this over to the side here, and we're gonna put it right behind the vine, like on the upper vine here. I'm gonna put it right behind, but in this like void area. So at the very beginning, nothing is gonna be visible. We're gonna animate our brush stroke. And before we actually go on with the animation, we wanna make sure that brush time properties is set to size and hardness. So if you ever wanna change the size and brush hardness, but you don't want it to affect the entire vine at once, like we'll have to do, we'll have to get the brush will have to get smaller and smaller and smaller as it reaches the end. You need to make sure this is on. Okay, so let's move forward here. Let's go 30 frames forward, and we'll just pull this out all the way to about here. And I totally labeled these the wrong thing. So this is actually the right hand side, and this is the left hand side. Okay, so now we should be good. I'm gonna click U to access my keyframes, and then I'm just gonna go halfway between these 2 keyframes and then pull this back up so it's going to follow the contours a little bit more closely. I find it easier just to go right to the very end. So it's like you're animating the key positions of the stroke along the curve, and then we're just in between it like you would in like a 2D animation class. Now right here, this line is getting very, very thick, and we want it to be closer to just showing these. Otherwise we're going to like stick through half of this vine all at the same time, which doesn't really make sense. So we're going to go before we reach that point. So around frame 15, and then we're going to start animating the brush size. I'm going to double click the U key so I can see all my keyframes again. And then by the time we get here, we want to have that brush size to be much smaller. So something like 20, reposition this down a little bit, and that should be enough. We might need 25, otherwise we might be missing off a little bit of the edges here. And then another thing you can see, the smaller the brush size, so if I load this even more, you can really tell it's stepping. So you want to take the brush spacing and then lower that. If you type in 0, it'll just go down to the lowest it can go. It does stick through a little bit, so what you could do at this point is lower this brush quite a bit to there, and then it should work. And then the same thing when we get here, we're gonna have to lower that again, think more like this, and that should be good. And then we'll keep going, maybe another 20 frames or so. We'll pull this all the way up here. Go halfway, pull this back down to the curve here, and then we'll also make this a little bit smaller. So when the brush reaches maybe halfway on here, we'll begin to animate this again. So we'll set a manual keyframe, and then by the time it reaches this one, we don't really need it to be 25, so 15 should be fine. We'll just pull this down so it's not interfering with this edge. Let me go a little bit further back using the page up keys. Something like this. We'll set a manual key for our brush. At this point, it's deviating quite a lot from the branch, so we'll just pull this back. And you could get really, really picky about things overlapping the edge here, but as long as you have another ride-on effect that's gonna go right at that point, it should be fine. If you wanted a little bit of a delay, it might look a bit odd if it's just sticking out and not doing anything, but for the purposes of this demo, I'm just gonna continue. Now, in order to utilize this as a matte, since we're drawing on the original image here, you can also say on transparent, which would actually give you an alpha, but you can only have a couple ride-on effects with on transparent on. If you want multiple, you're gonna have to leave it on original image. So on our vine right, we'd have to pull this above vine right, and on vine right, we'd set the track matte to be Luma. So this is what we have so far. We have the vine just being pulled out like this, and it's growing. So it's pretty tedious, as you can see. This method is going to take a little bit of time, but if you don't have something that's a vector and you don't have, already drawn out all the different splines, you can't really use the stroke effect. So this is the next best thing. So you could also do it with pen tools and just drawing out masks, and that's definitely an option, but the ride-on effect is a little bit easier to use than so many masks. I'm going to turn this track matte back off, and then I'm going to pull this back down here just so we can see what we're doing. And I'm not going to show you the entire thing here, otherwise this tutorial will go on for hours, but I will show you just a couple more of these little branches here. So for this second branch, what we can do, move our point, and we can start it down here. We can increase the size to something like 25 again, and you never want to have a offshoot starting right here, because if it starts right here at the very beginning, if it doesn't animate along with the main vine, you're going to reveal the offshoot before it would be possible for that offshoot to exist. So we're going to have this further down. Set the brush position, we'll do size and hardness, and then we'll just go forward about 10 frames or so, something like this. Now you can always retime these if you realize the whole thing is going too slowly or too quickly. It's always possible to do. Now at this point where there's two different options, you can either cover both evenly, so they both go at the same rate. You can stick to one side and make the brush really small as it follows one curve, or you can do something like this, where you go up all the way on one side here, and then just go forward one frame, and then come back the same way, and then you can continue on the second one. It's going to save you a little bit of time doing that, otherwise you're going to have a lot of different ride-on effects. Change the brush size here, we'll allow it to go down to something like 15, and then we'll go, let's say, just another 15 frames or something like that. We'll pull this all the way up here, and at this point we'll pull this down, go across, have it go across, and then we'll have it come back. So we'll start back down there, might be a little bit high. So that should cover the leaf entirely here. If you wanted to get a little bit thicker at this point, all you have to do is set a brush size keyframe, go forward a couple frames to the point at which it needs to be larger, and then just increase the size. And because we're never actually going to be looking at this matte, if it looks pretty hideous like around here, it doesn't matter because this image doesn't go that far. And then at this point here, what we'll need to do is either pull this back out and have it do this leaf before it does up here, which that's definitely possible to do, or we would have to add another ride-on effect. So what I will do here, I'll have that kind of stop. I'll go up here just a bit. So I will just make a new ride-on effect for this one. Pull this over here. I'll just start this back here, it's fine. Do something like 25, should be big enough. Brush position, I don't need to do the size on this one. I'm gonna open this up so I can see the keyframes. Go forward, I don't know, a few frames, and just cover this. Something like that. Okay, so let's see what we have with this offshoot now. All right, so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna pull this matte back above vine right, and then set the track matte on vine right to be the Luma matte. Okay, so this is what we have so far. Yeah, so it's a pretty cool effect. It does take a bit of work, and it is a bit tedious. There's no automated way in its current state that we could do this. You'll also notice there's a little bit of a speck right here at the beginning. So what we need to do, go back to our vine matte and see what is causing that. So it looks like it's going to be this ride-on effect 2. So open this up, and we need to go and find the very first keyframe. So we'll just go one in front of that. And And on the write-on effect here, we can just pull this up, something like that. So now at the beginning, it won't show up. All right, so there's obviously a lot more work to be done on these vines here, but what we could do now is do something with the vine text, and then the whole thing would be kind of transferred over, and you do the same thing on the left-hand side as well. But for the vines, we need to pre-compose both of these layers together. So I'm just going to pre-compose vine text. Now on vine text, we could use a write-on effect as well. So as this main vine passes over, we can then start revealing the text. Now again, we could decide to use a path, but if we're using the write-on effect, it's going to give us a bit more control. So we're going to have 5 different write-on effects. So I'll actually rename these for each letter. We'll start with S, click enter, and then go to the beginning and just call this S. So on the brush position, we can start this maybe at around frame 40. Okay, so I'm just going to position this brush to start right underneath the letter S, and then set the brush size to be about 30, or maybe we'll do 40. And then I'll just lower this a little bit like this. Animate the brush position, and then let's go forward 20 frames or so, and we'll just go directly to the very end of S. And then halfway between that, we'll fill in this area here. Halfway between that, we'll just make sure we're at this curve here. You might need to make this just a little bit smaller, maybe something around 35 will be a little bit easier to work with. And actually, we will set this to be size and hardness. And at the very beginning, we will animate the brush size at 40. So we'll say 40 at the beginning, or even 45 at the beginning. Double click the U key to access that new channel. But then by the time we get here, I think 40 is fine, but we might want to just lower this to 35. Maybe after a couple keyframes more like that. That looks pretty good. And then at this point, we probably want to have this further over here. And then we can set that back up to 40 in a couple keyframes. So something like this. Now we will need another write-on effect for this part here. So I'm going to grab another one, and I'll just call this S2. We'll start this right there. We'll have the brush size probably at 30, that's probably fine. And then right at the very beginning, we will start animating this so it's at the same rate as the right-hand side of S as it goes up. So we'll start this right here. Double click U to see it. And we'll just do something like that. And I will increase the brush size to like 45. Let's do something like that. Again, what we'll need to do at this point is make a new solid for a matte. We'll say vine text matte. And we'll just transfer these effects over. So the way you transfer effects in After Effects, make sure you start at the very first keyframe. So at frame 40, you'll just do Ctrl X to cut them, and then paste them back on the same keyframe. So we'll change vine text to be Luma. And it looks like at the very beginning, this is too visible. So on the very first keyframe of both of these, we're just going to need to pull down our brush stroke a little bit so we don't see any of the S. So it's going to give the impression that it's being drawn. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of this and then show you the final result. Okay, so I'm back with the finished result here of all of the different write-on effects being used to reveal the vines and the text. There's quite a few effects on each one, but I think the result looks pretty interesting, pretty cool. So we could go in, finesse the animations. I'm not actually going to do that right now. So for this next part, and this is optional, this depends on what your composition is, but let's say you wanted to change the composition, because I feel like everything is a little bit pushed over to the left and there's a lot of white space here we're not doing anything with. What if we wanted to enlarge this group or enlarge this group or move it or rotate it? So we're going to create a new null object and we'll call this left, and we'll create another one called right. So on the left one, we need vine left, which is going to be this one with the growing text as well. Attach that to left. And then we're going to grab all these ones here and attach that one to right. So now all we have to do is, with the right one selected or the left one, whichever one, we can move this around, we can rotate it, we can scale it up. Click S and just scale this up. So on the left hand side one, we can do the same thing. We can pull this up, make this a little bit larger. maybe lower the rotation very slightly. And I think the scale is better on the lower one. So something more like this is a little bit more appealing. You could go back to the right side. I could just tweak the rotation slightly, pull this in more. So we're getting closer to the center, and then pull this in a bit more as well. Something more like that. I think that's gonna work a little bit better. So after I've done that, then I could just go in and add some color correction. I think just for the background, I like the contrast of the trees and the vines, but I think that the background just lacks a little bit of contrast. So what we could do here, just grab a curves effect, just pull down the darks a little bit, and then pull the midtones and highlights back up to the original position. Looks a little bit better. And then at the very end, what we can do is add a vignette. And what the vignette's gonna do is it's gonna pull your eye into the scene a little bit more. But I think the default state is all right. And if you wanted to mess around just a little bit with highlights again, you could add another curves effect over everything and just kind of boost those highlights just a little bit. Then I'm gonna add just a tint of blue back into this. All right, so here's the final result. All right, so that wraps up this tutorial. If you guys learned something, drop a like. If you have any questions, drop a comment. I'll get back to you as soon as I can, and I'll be back very soon with some more content. All right, peace.